Let's talk about whether or not any of this is even necessary. Now, we had an extraordinary reaction to an interview I did last week with Dr. Mike Yeadon. He's the former chief scientific advisor with Pfizer, the major pharmaceutical company. And he, along with many others, including Carl Hennigan, the professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University, and I really defy anyone to question those credentials, have been questioning whether or not we are, well, horribly overreacting to a virus that, like all viruses, we are going to have to learn to live with, and big question marks over whether or not the policies with many Western governments, including the UK's, have been following over the recent months are actually having any effect at all. Well, let's talk about all of this once again with Dr. Mike Yeadon, back, I think, quite literally by popular demand. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia. Nice to be back.
Lovely to talk to you. We've had almost 100,000 views on YouTube of your video. Lots of reaction on Twitter. A lot of people just saying, great to actually hear someone sort of expand this. Now, let's just talk about some really basic stuff here. We saw yesterday 3,991 positive cases for coronavirus. It's up 50% in a week. You can understand why huge numbers of people are incredibly worried that we're seeing that uptick in cases. Should we be worried?
Well, thanks for having me back, Julia. Of course, I definitely don't want to dismiss the possibility that these numbers are real and that people will get ill and potentially go to hospital or even die. But the evidence to date, I think, suggests that all or a substantial part of these positives could be due to what's called false positive tests. Now, government knows that the PCR test is very sensitive, and all tests have a propensity to throw up a particular false positive rate. What's really frustrating, Julie, and your listeners should know this, the government doesn't know what the false positive rate is, or if it does, it's not declaring it and continuing with the assumption that it's zero, and it's definitely not zero. And Carl Hennigan did a calculation, and he showed that if the false positive rate is as little as 0.1%, then more than half the positive tests are in fact false or fake. And I think the false positive rate is probably much higher, possibly 1%. And if that's true, most or all of the positives are actually false, and they're not infected, infectious or ill.
And the key thing there is, of course, I mean, again, for those of us who are not medically trained or scientifically trained, or indeed a great mathematicians either, it's because the actual percentage of people who are being tested positive is a tiny percentage. So if you have a false positive rate at that level, you actually are accounting for effectively all of the positive test results.